All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and this is Matt. And in this video, we are going to debunk two specific arguments associated with whale evolution. These specific arguments will involve pseudogenes and also an argument from embryological development, an argument that is showcased in a video by Stated Clearly. And so we are going to go over these two specific lines of evidence. Why only these two, though, is because we released about a week ago a comprehensive video. It was about 45 minutes. It featured myself, Matt, you were there as well, Dr. Grady McMurtry, and Dr. Jerry Bergman. On three separate accounts, we addressed the fossil evidence for whale evolution. That includes Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Durdon, Rhodocetus, Basilosaurus, right up to extant whales. But two lines of evidence that we did not engage in that video has to do with pseudogenes, the argument from pseudogenes, and then embryological development. So that's what we're going to engage here in this video. So Matt, we're going to get right into it, brother. We got some good stuff. You and I, we've been over the last couple of days, we've been discussing this. We've been brainstorming ideas, and we've got some solid rebuttals to these so-called challenges. And so why don't we start with Stated Clearly's clip here. Now, what I'd like to do in the future, sometime in the next month when we find time, is Matt and I, we're going to do a comprehensive video, 2 hours or so, where we're going to go through Stated Clearly's video, sentence by sentence, point by point, dismantling the entire thing. But just for this video, we want a video for people, a go-to video addressing these two specific arguments. And so, Matt, I am going to share screen, brother. I'm going to hit mute so there's no echo, and here we go.
Here we see a dolphin and a human embryo side by side at similar stages of development. Notice that they both have what look like arm buds and leg buds. In humans, the leg buds grow to become legs. In whales, they grow for a while but then stop, effectively fading away as the rest of the whale continues to grow. These are all photographs of a common dolphin at different stages of growth. Notice that early on, we see two nostril grooves on the front of the face, just like you'd expect in a puppy or a human. As the dolphin continues to grow, the nostrils migrate to the top of the head and fuse together, becoming the dolphin's blowhole. So far, we have multiple facts from two independent lines of study.
All right, Matt. So let's specifically engage those ones, starting with the first argument based on embryological development. We've got a dolphin embryo and a human embryo. And so Stated Clearly here is comparing the two, and he is saying in the early stages of embryological development, in both the dolphin and the human, we've got arm buds and leg buds present in both dolphins and humans. But over time, during these developmental stages and windows in the dolphin embryo, those arm buds and leg buds are reabsorbed. And so they're not an aspect or component of the final creature, of the dolphin when it's born. But in humans, they do develop into full-blown arms and legs. And so the argument is essentially, okay, if there are arm buds and leg buds in the dolphin embryo and they get reabsorbed, well, this must mean, so they're inferring or extrapolating that to mean dolphins must have descended from a mammal tetrapod, a walking mammal tetrapod, clearly land dwelling. And so, Matt, what are your thoughts on that, brother?
Well, on the surface level, I would say, sure, makes sense. Looks pretty good. But once you dive into it even remotely, you would ask yourself another question. You would say, well, what about sharks? How come we look over and we'll find sharks that also have limbs? No one would ever say that sharks evolved on land. Their common ancestor didn't. So why would sharks have limb buds and develop actual limbs in this area where there would be fins? Well, we now have that answer, actually. And in Nature magazine, scientists showed that although originating from different cell types, human limbs and median fins share a common developmental mechanism. So I highlighted this area down here, but we can read it all. The researchers started by marking the different cells from the embryo and following their development in order to understand which cells originated the different parts of making of the shark's body. Next, they investigated the activity of different genes during fin development. From these two experiments, the colleagues discovered that the median fin of cat sharks, although originating from different embryonic cells, used the same genes, the HOX and the TBX18, during development as limbs and paired fins. So what's happening is it's getting a mutation, and the fins do not develop, and actual limbs do. So we can see genetic errors occurring in the exact same way when people say, well, look, there's a limb that can grow out on the face of a fly, or a fly can grow extra wings. Well, yes, they can. These are mutations. These are advantageous. These are detrimental to the organism. That doesn't help it, benefit it, do it whatsoever. So how come we would find limb buds on a shark? It was just a developmental stage, and we now have the answer saying right here, it's a developmental common mechanism that we're seeing, and now we know that it's in the same genes, but the development is different based on what the organism actually is. You see, in our model, we explain this through genetic built-in diversity. Evolution says, well, it's because the ancestor of the whale was walking on land, but they wouldn't say that about the shark, but yet it has the exact same criteria. So we could answer why they would why they would start developing limb buds and then get rid of them, because the womb itself would be perhaps in a developmental stage where the organism might need to move more in that region, in that time. And then later it doesn't need it anymore, so they get retracted, they get reduced and removed, because it's a phenotypic thing that needs to happen later in life that they just don't require. They don't need it anymore, so it's gone. It's not an evolutionary leftover. So I would say, here it is. A mouse and a whale and a human being are identical in size and shape the moment of conception. We all start small, round, single cells, and all development of the same type of environment. Should it really be a shock to anyone that we share a lot of similarities during these stages? Limbs.
If you could stop there, because you made so many good points so far. If we were to compare different car companies and pick different cars, let's take an SUV, a sedan, a hatchback, and a van. Early stages of manufacturing, all of these cars, even though the end products are very different, they're all unique in their own ways. They all have differences. The early stages would all be very similar in the same way that these creatures, a mouse, a whale, a human being, they have a lot of similarities in embryological development at first. But as the baby grows and develops over time, the end product, in the same way that the end products of these car manufacturing companies, they are the most different at that point when development is complete. So I think we see some commonalities in that respect. Matt, what do you think, brother?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And we would also see that the same thing play out when we look at hands, right? We can look at the hands, the development of a human and a frog. Though we have the same digits that look somewhat like this, they end up growing fingers, and we end up growing fingers as well. Theirs are how they grow out is different. Theirs grows out from the hand. Ours grow actually like a web, and the web disappears between the fingers, and then we have them. So developmentally, when you see the early stages, though, they look the same. So how they phenotypically look at the end are completely different, but in the embryo they look very similar to each other.
Right, right. And so these arm buds and limb buds, and I understand you want to continue here. So let me ask this question, then continue. The dolphin in early stages of development, these developmental windows, these babies have to move around, shift around. Do you think that there's some kind of use or function for those temporary buds before they're reabsorbed to help them move around and shift?
Yeah, why not? I mean, the smaller, the newer an organism is, the more it's going to be weaker in certain areas. So until the other muscles develop, something else has to help it, right? So it makes sense that it's got some ability to have limb buds so it can move around, it can do something.
It's like an assistance feature, a temporary feature that assists the creature.
Exactly. I mean, it makes total sense. So I would have to say that since limbs and fins share the same code, and sometimes those codes get scrambled, what we call mutations, it's why we find limbs on some of these things when they're actually born, but they're always useless. They're always advantageous, detrimental. You don't find them ever being used. We don't find sharks with those legs now walking on land. We don't find the dolphins walking or using the legs that if they get that mutation and they form them. Where's the use of it? It's not there. So, where am I? It has nothing to do with evolutionary leftover remnants. If evolution was actually true, then some humans would be born with gills, right? Because they say, oh, we have gill slits and we have tails that are vestigial. But yet, even by genetic mistakes, a human being can't produce either one of those because we just don't have either one and never had those for the genetic makeup inside of us. Now, some people say, oh, we do have tails. No, we don't. There's no bone in there. There's no function whatsoever. It's just a fatty left deposit that's completely useless. So we also would have to consider why they would have, I'm sorry, I already covered the bottom. That was part of our talk. So that was what I have to say. So limbs and fins, what we know now from the new discovery is that although they're originating from different cell types, the limbs and fins share the common developmental mechanism. So that's exactly what we would expect to see because the same coder designed everything. And then sometimes those codes get messed up and scrambled from mutations. And then that we can see that. So again, I would say, well, why would a shark now have limb buds, and why would they produce limbs where there should be fins? These are just genetic mistakes. It doesn't say, there's no common ancestry going back to that. So they can't claim in this area, they can't say, well, it's true for dolphins, but it's not true for sharks. Well, it has to be. Evolution it encompasses everything. So I don't see it for them.
Very good. Yeah, I think those are excellent arguments. It goes back to the design diversity hypothesis that we believe in and put forth as a testable model, where organisms are created at creation with a lot of diversity that can be utilized for adaptation. And so these features, the features that evolutionists call vestigial, or if we look to the genome, these features that they argue are the result of genetic mistakes, ancient viral infections. No, the prediction of the biblical creationist, the expectation of a design diversity starting point is function. And so when we see features like this, we would predict function and use, and that's what we find. And so it's not evidence for common descent. And so his second example there, we're supposedly early in these embryological stages of the dolphin. You have the blowhole that's closer to where the nasal opening supposedly is closer to where the nose would be. And then over time, if I understood his argument correctly there, it shifts to the top where the blowhole would be. And so he's arguing basically that, okay, this is evidence over time that sorry, I'm losing my voice here. Over time, a creature like Pakicetus, a mammal tetrapod, eventually evolved over time into an aquatic mammal, and as a result, that nasal opening would have to migrate to being a blowhole. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Well, I mean, that's a just again another assumption based on why we can easily say the exact opposite to be true. We can say, look at that, how well that's designed, that it's not there to begin with because it doesn't need to be. Everything is designed by the same gene, the Hox gene, which is the body layout plan. And during developmental stages, everything falls into place because when you add mutations anywhere to the Hox gene, there's always a detrimental factor that comes from it. So why, when they mutate the gene, don't they get any of these developmental features that aren't horrendously detrimental to the are beneficial to the creature? They don't. They get detrimental outcomes from it. So they can claim that, oh, this is showing evolutionary remnant left over from adaptations of when its nose was there, and all that's happening is that the mutation happened in the Hox gene, and now it slowly transitions and moves over there where it's totally beneficial for the organism that changed over eons of time. Yeah, sure, you can make that story up, but you can't show any evidence for it because you add a mutation to that Hox gene in that developmental stage, and you're going to deform that creature for life, and it will most likely be either horrendously deformed or it'll die. So game over.
These creatures in early embryological development, they're clearly very small. Everything's condensed. Nothing's fully formed. Things are growing, right? The developmental process is at work. And so at that point, it's an elegant design where you have the blowhole situated in an area where over time it migrates to where it's supposed to be. That's not evidence. That would be an extrapolation fallacy to say, well, that's evidence that there was a creature that a dolphin descended from that actually had the nasal opening in the front, like we would, and it evolved over time into a blowhole.
It would be like using your analogy where there's a car and it's on its third stage of development out of 100, and I come over and say, man, this is going to make a great dune buggy. Well, it's not. It doesn't have a roof yet. It doesn't have anything. It's just the base structure. And I've assumed it's something entirely different than it actually is going to be when it's the finished product.
Exactly. The biggest differences are in the end products, the end stages. That's where we see the big differences. I bet we could pick a sedan. We could go to an assembly plant. We can look at a van, a sedan, an SUV. Let's look at the early stages of, let's say, an SUV. And the way things are forming and the way things are shifting and being put into place, we could point to something and say, hey, look at the way this looks, and extrapolate that to mean this SUV has evolved over time from a hatchback because of this similar. No, it's because things are being worked. Things are being moved around in a way where, okay, this is going to be an SUV, or this product is going to be a sedan or a hatchback. Does that make sense, Matt? That analogy?
Yeah, I see no problem with it. Only the haters do.
The ones that don't want to believe, right?
Exactly.
They'll find anything.
Happy anyway, so who cares what their opinion is?
Okay, well, there we go. So there's not a whole lot there. They're going to have to extrapolate and infer. There's a lot of assumptions at play. And so here is a sufficient rebuttal for people to utilize when the critics bring up that argument from embryological development. And so here's the next argument, Matt. It's a two-part argument. I'll share screen. There's at least one article here on it. And so there's two here. I'll summarize. I've heard it enough. I'll represent them accurately. So you have baleen whales where they, rather than teeth, they basically got these bristles, kind of like a toothbrush, these bristles. And so this is a pseudogene related argument. It's a two-parter because there's a pseudogene argument from tooth genes. There's another one from smelling genes. We'll stick with this one. They're both relatively going to have a similar answer. So these baleen whales, which don't have teeth, apparently they have pseudogenes, broken genes. So they no longer code for a protein. It's It's a genetic mistake, they'll argue, but they are tooth genes, broken tooth genes. And so they infer that to mean that at one point, these baleen whales, they must have an ancestor. They must share a common ancestor with a whale that has or had teeth. And over time, those teeth evolved into baleen. Okay. So this article goes into it in detail. It's called Toothless Baleen Whales Have Remnants of Tooth Genes. Very similar to the argument from ERVs, right? The ancient remnants of past viral infections. Well, the question is, are those really the ancient remnants of past viral infections, or are they created units of DNA function? And the bigger picture response on pseudogenes is that a lot of what are claimed to be pseudogenes or broken genes, genetic mistakes, are necessary to sustain healthy life processes. They're essential, many functions associated with them. A lot of pseudogenes are actually regulating the protein coding counterpart. Okay, and we can go into some of those lines of evidence later. And so they point out blue, gray, and humpback whales are among the largest animals to have ever existed on the earth. And it gets into the baleen one specifically and the function for the baleen. There's a picture here. And these whales apparently have these pseudogenes for teeth. And so here's the question they ask. Why would the creator create non-functional tooth genes in whales that completely lack teeth? Well, the first assumption, why does the creator have to create a genetic mistake? I mean, we would agree that genetic mistakes are going to occur over time due to mutation accumulation. Mutations are introduced generation after generation in all creatures. So then he asks, why would the creator put the exact same inactivating mutations in multiple species? Okay, there are two major assumptions or starting points with the creation and evolution model, one for each. The starting point or major assumption of the evolutionary model is that all DNA differences, all DNA diversity is the result of what, Matt? Mutations over time. All DNA differences are the result of mutations over time. That's why the evolutionist requires lots of time for speciation, change, adaptation, because the diversity that mechanisms like natural selection and environment can act upon, mutations need to accumulate to result in that genetic diversity, okay? But the creationist, like us, we argue our starting point is design diversity, or in technical terms, created heterozygosity. Heterozygosity is just a fancy way of saying that these creatures exist. They're designed in a state of DNA diversity. This goes back to basic genetics, basic alleles. An allele being a genetic variant, right? You got capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. In that instance, you're genetically heterozygous. If you're capital A, capital A, capital B, then you're genetically homogeneous. Our starting point, God would have front-loaded the original created kinds, this includes whales, with a lot of genetic diversity that can result in change and adaptation. And so a lot of what we see in terms of these DNA elements, like pseudogenes, the evolutionists are assuming they are the result, or they've come about through mutations. And the DNA differences, like for example, here they ask, why would the creator put the exact same inactivating mutations in multiple species? Again, those mutations, they're assuming are mutations, when in fact they might reflect the function of those DNA elements. Across different species, there's going to be a diversity of functional roles, okay? And so those are just a couple thoughts. But Matt, what are your thoughts on this argument?
I would have to say that if we compare a whale and a shark, we're going to find that they have a lot of differences, but they also have a lot of the same things. You and I have the same capacity to see and smell and taste and hear. A shark has the same thing. They can smell, they can see, they can hear, and you can compare them with a whale. And what happens when we do that? Well, let's look at smell. if we go here, sorry, unlike whales, sharks can smell underwater by detecting the scent molecules that disperse in the water, bypassing the scent-laden water through their nasal cavities. So they smell, but in a very different way than whales. So they were created differently. Why? Because a shark is smelling for blood. They're hunting something. They are going, their function and purpose on Earth when God designed them was different than it was for a whale. So they have the capacity to smell, but they smell differently. So therefore, they are going to have differences. So I would say the best way to do something is to compare things, so like I just did with the shark and the whale. So we can do that by going, well, why would a whale have like the main topic was for teeth, right? So, well, whales aren't like sharks. Sharks are out there as obligate carnivores, hunting and killing. Whales are not, but blue whales, for this specific region or this topic. So whales have a capacity to hear, and they pick up sound in a different way entirely. So the blue whale, which is the largest animal on Earth, which supposedly evolved from the Pachycetus land animal, it can produce loud whistling calls that reach up to 188 decibels. These calls can travel up to 500 miles underwater. That's a long way. And that means they can travel so far because other whales can also hear from that far away. It's a long distance. But the loudest is the sperm whale. It makes a series of clicking noises that can reach as high as 230 decibels, making it the loudest animal on Earth. Pretty interesting. And when it comes to hearing, they have incredible hearing as well, and more octaves than humans. So check this out. Whales have some of the widest hearing ranges of any mammal, and that some species are capable of hearing a seismic or hyper ultrasonic frequencies. We now know that some species of whales have 12 octave hearing range compared to humans, which have 8. So they can hear much better than us, even underwater. Now it gets even better. So for sight, we have 20/20. Whales have 240. Incredible, right? Because they're underwater. The distance you can see underwater isn't very far as a human being, but whales can see much further. How far? They can see up to 35 feet or about 10.7 meters ahead of them while they're moving. So completely different sight, which is amazing. And then we compare this to the shark. Now, a shark's main thing is for the smelling of blood, which they can smell up to a quarter mile away. That's what makes it so dangerous to go in the water if you have a cut, because they don't see very good, so they can attack you based on the scent. And their main thing actually comes down to their acute sense of hearing. This is the main capacity of what's probably their best, the most heightened sense out of everything that they have is their hearing. After that, it would come down to their smell and their scent. Totally opposite of whales, but they live in the same environment. They just have different functions. So this is what we're talking about now. When it comes to like the junk DNA, there's different coding being done on the protein coding genes that transcribe what needs to develop in these creatures and what needs to happen in the final product of the creature based on what they were designed to do. Whales don't, these blue whales, they eat something entirely different than a shark. So they don't need teeth. They don't have them. There's no need for them. So again, entirely different created creature with different functions. So I hope I didn't lose track of the topic.
No, that's great. And this speaks to the uniqueness of these different created kinds. When it comes to the baleen whales, rather than teeth like we have, and teeth are great. We use teeth for many things, including eating, chewing things. And so whales that don't have teeth, well, the baleen is being used to collect their food and filter things out, trap prey, from my understanding, in their mouths. And so why can't a lot of these genes be active or functional in the functions of the baleen. That's what they're using instead of teeth. And evolutionists are assuming that these are true pseudogenes, broken genes, when in fact they may have a function specific to the baleen whale.
Right. We don't. What happens is we do a lot of knockout tests to test what a gene does on mice, but we don't do it on whales. So they're just assuming that, oh, well, they look at that. They have a broken teeth gene, but they still produce something like teeth in there, but it's these things to trap krill, which is their little shrimp, which is their main food source. And that's there, clearly a functional element that they don't need teeth. You don't need teeth to eat a little tiny little krill. The shrimp in our hand is small. Now imagine the largest animal on earth, which is the blue whale. It definitely doesn't need to have teeth to eat something that can fit in our hand. It's just pointless. So this is goes back to their assumption. Like usual, they're assuming that, oh, it must be broken because they're assuming that its ancestor had teeth. All assumption based yet again.
Right. And so when it comes to the so-called whale smelling genes, because as you put it, whales lack the ability to smell. And so these olfactory genes apparently are broken. And so they argue that at some point the whale must share a common ancestor with a mammal that has the ability to smell. And over time, those genes break. But you've pointed out that the whale, correct me if I'm wrong, has an amazing eyesight, or it can see far greater than a lot of other creatures. And go ahead.
Right. Yes, they can hear very good. They can communicate with each other for almost 500 miles away. It's just incredible what they have the capacity to do. Right. So their functions on what they do is very different. Sharks aren't communicating with one another. Whales are. They recognize each other. They can see each other and recognize each other. They travel in packs together. Sharks don't do this. There's no need for them to. Whales are constantly communicating with each other and other species of whales. They communicate with one another. So it's amazing that what they can do. And it's completely different than sharks. So again, it's going back to this assumption that, oh, it must have, because it was a land animal, it must have had some of these features. And then anytime something is lost, like their ability to smell like they would on land, they go, well, it's just a mutation that brought that on. Again,
Right.
Mutate that Hox gene. You're going to get a little tiny land animal the size of a chihuahua to a gigantic whale in just 50 million years. That's not a lot of time to do that when we know about the fixation of beneficial mutations rising up now. That's the problem, waiting time problem. But that's a whole nother problem. Right now, we're just talking about the phenotypic and homology structures.
Well, they're making inferences, or they are extrapolating ideas that are contradictory or in conflict with the known genetic data. And what we mean by that is mutations and natural selection are not up to the task to take a creature like Pachycetus into a blue whale over time. There's novel adaptations that need to take place. There are many truly beneficial mutations that would need to arise and become fixed. We would have to see an increase in phenotypic complexity, a lot of true novelty, in order to take a small creature like Pachycetus, a land-dwelling mammalian tetrapod, into an aquatic mammal. But this whole argument from pseudogenes in general is assuming that all DNA differences are the result of mutations. They're assuming that these DNA elements are truly genetic mistakes. And we could spend an hour going over all of the amazing functional roles associated with pseudogenes. A major question is, why do pseudogenes look like their healthy counterparts? Well, we actually understand now that and I did a whole presentation on junk DNA refuting it. The pseudogene expression actually helps to regulate the translation of its protein coding counterpart. Right? You got DNA transcribed in RNA translated into a protein. But if you have a gene that doesn't code for a protein, Okay. And then they assume, well, at one point it was a protein coding gene, but it was hit with damaging mutations. And so now it's lost its function. Well, again, these DNA units that they are calling pseudogenes have important functional roles that are related to its protein coding counterpart. And so a lot of these long non-coding RNAs, they have many important functions. They're necessary to sustain healthy life processes, as I said earlier. And so we know too little about the DNA language, Matt, to conclude with any real level of certainty that these so-called pseudogenes really are broken smelling genes like olfactory genes or broken tooth genes. I want to pick your brain a little bit, bounce a couple ideas off of you. Okay, worst case scenario, or let's, for sake of argument, say that these are truly broken smelling genes, olfactory genes. Okay, how does that extrapolate to whales at one point being able to walk? These walking whales like Indohyus and Pakicetus. I mean, at best, you have whales thousands of years ago that had the ability to smell, but then over time, because maybe their other senses, like their sight, their hearing, as you've pointed out, they're superior to the ability to smell, that natural selection simply did not preserve that function, and mutations hit those genes and they broke. How does that mean that they share a common ancestor with a a walking mammal? Matt, tell me that.
It's funny because that very question is genetic entropy. It's genetic decline, genetic degradation. And it also goes to what you said earlier about protein coding genes are breaking and becoming junk DNA, right? Just transcription. That's also genetic entropy. Have you realized that? Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
It's genetic entropy as well. So that would actually be
mutation accumulation.
Yeah, that would be part of our model as well. So junk DNA would actually be a young Earth creation prediction if you think about it.
Right.
I never considered that, but yeah, junk DNA would actually be something we would predict. But in a reality, there's not enough time for a complete eradication for junk DNA to be at the levels that they are at in just 6,000 years. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And the thing I find interesting is that I made a little list right here. If you look at what they call junk DNA, they're the literal genetic blueprints that tell proteins when and where to activate in highly constrained developmental genes, like the Hox gene, the Sonic the Hedgehog gene, the BMP gene, FGF gene. These are all junk to evolutionists, by the way, and yet no life could exist without them. None. All of these non-protein genes, which are under strong purifying selection, are being coded by what is called junk DNA. Let that sink in.
Right. I mean, there's evidence that the human genome is largely active. Over 80% activity, at least 60% of the genome transcribed into RNA, and the human genome has been studied much more than a lot of these creatures, of course. Right. And so we would guess, we could predict that there's a lot of activity in the whale genome as well.
Absolutely.
And within that activity, we find these pseudogenes. Now, we would agree that there are true broken genes because mutations accumulate in mammals. In the entirety of the biological world, the mutation rate is largely, it's fast, it's high in mammals in general. And so, I mean, in humans, it's about 100 new mutations per person per generation. And so over thousands of years, you are going to expect some true broken genes. Just because you go onto a car lot and you see scratches, dings, dents, rust marks on all kinds of cars, it doesn't mean that they accumulated those mistakes, that damage from past common ancestors. Okay, we're all living in the same world. We're experiencing similar problems. But the first question we need to ask is, are these truly genetic mistakes? Are these truly broken genes, because we understand, and there's different kinds of pseudogenes. You know, we could do, again, we could do an entire program on the different types of pseudogenes, unitary pseudogenes, for example. But we understand that, like with unitary pseudogenes, they're playing a functional role in gene regulation because they are part of functional transcription families. Earlier, we talked about how the expression from pseudogenes helps to regulate the translation of its protein coding counterpart. So there's a lot of amazing functional roles associated with what the evolutionists call genetic mistakes. There's another interesting function that I've discussed here on the channel with PhD scientists, one being Dr. Fuz Rana, biochemist, and it's called the pseudogene decoy hypothesis, where basically the RNA that's produced by the pseudogene RNA acts as a decoy for things that might actually target the correct RNA for degradation from the protein coding counterpart. And so what does that do as a result? It increases the lifespan of that specific mRNA and therefore increases the amount of translation being very important. And so these are just 3 examples of how functional these so-called pseudogenes are. But again, even for sake of argument, if they are true broken genes, that doesn't necessarily mean you can extrapolate that to say that these aquatic mammals evolved from land-dwelling mammals, right, Matt?
Yeah, again, they're trying to, usually, from what I can tell, they like their fossils. That's where they can do most of their storytelling. So when they're looking at the whales, they're just assuming, well, that story is true. So therefore, those must be joking. These must be broken because they're missing it, and these must have mutated because they're different. So they want their cake and eat it too. You can't go wrong, right? They can just tell you anything that they need to match. It's unfalsifiable.
Like I could understand the baleen example, because if we were to concede that, okay, these pseudogenes, tell me if you agree with me, if we were to agree or concede that, okay, these are true pseudogenes, true broken genes for teeth. Okay, well then we would have to admit that baleen has evolved from teeth, which one could argue is a true novelty, the kind of change we might not expect as creationists. We'd have to dig a little deeper and see how much change on a molecular level is taking place. Speak to that a little bit.
Okay, loss of teeth. Okay, whoop-de-doo, it lost teeth. It didn't get them. Remember, evolutionary trees.
But then evolved the baleen?
The baleen? What?
Well, so a baleen whale has baleen, these bristles, rather than teeth.
Right, exactly. So it lost teeth, right?
Lost teeth, but then evolved baleen?
Hmm?
But then evolved the baleen?
Right, exactly. So
as a creationist, would we, but within, let's say, the thousands of years since the flood,
right,
would we as a creationist say that that possibility is there, that the teeth could be lost and then baleen evolved?
Oh, no, I'm just saying that if we had to answer, like, why in the world, if there was an ancestor to our whale that had teeth, it was just another species. Like there was a cat, and then all of a sudden you see the saber-toothed cat, and it's got a giant tusk tooth hanging out of it. Why? It had to kill mammoth. Mammoth had thick hides. And then all of a sudden the mammoth started to die off, and the cats, they died off as well because they lived in the tundra. So now there's no more cats with the large teeth. Well, guess what? It's a loss of information. It's just a tweak. It wasn't very hard for it to gain it, just like it wasn't very hard to lose it. So when we're talking about how about a new set of teeth growing into a whale? That's a lot of information that as a young Earth creation, we go, wow, that's a lot of new information being added that we didn't see there to begin with. It didn't have teeth ancestor, but to lose it would be easy to us to explain because it's a lot of information to lose.
So from my understanding, the evolutionary story is that ancient whales had teeth. There were certain whales that had teeth, and over time they lost those teeth and then eventually evolved baleen. Would that be an increase in information, new information?
Yeah, Yeah, because it's a new physical adaptation being in. It's not like it added extra ribs or something that the genetic material or the blueprint is written already in the code. This is an entirely new code being added. So, like if a new species of dog comes out and it can smell better or it can taste stronger food, big deal. But if it comes out and has ribs growing out of its back, it's got like a disc, like a dinosaur. Okay, wow, that's a whole new creature with new information that didn't exist literally in any other dog breed anywhere.
So in the case of the so-called tooth pseudogenes in baleen whales in their genomes, we would best argue that these aren't actually tooth genes that are broken, but functional genes, but functional in something else.
Right, exactly. They have multiple functions. All genes do, even the most highly conserved
protein multifunctionality.
Right, exactly. We see it in everything, and you can really see it in things that when they mutate, because they mutate and they affect all different kinds of regions. Because, like you said, every protein coding gene has a lot of alleles. So when one of those messes up, they cause a different type of problem.
Lots of backup genes.
That's a good way to find out what the functions are.
So I can kind of see where the evolutionists would have a point with the tooth genes in baleen whales, because if those truly are broken tooth genes and baleen whales once had teeth and then lost them and evolved baleen, okay, it still doesn't demonstrate that they came from a walking mammal. But with the smelling genes, that doesn't really demonstrate anything at all. So over time, let's just say hypothetically whales pre-flood could smell, and then over time they through deleterious mutation accumulation and natural selection not really doing much to preserve that function because of its other superior senses, then those genes become defunct. They become destroyed. So even if those are pseudogenes, the evolutionist doesn't really have a case, do they?
No, because it's not a function that it benefits the whale in any way anyway. So we would easily say like, well, it doesn't need it, so it's not there, right? Kind of like bats. Bats also have sonar, very similar to whales. So do they need to smell, or do they just rely on their sonar? Well, they rely on their sonar. They don't need to smell. So do they have? How is their scent? I bet you anything, it's probably not very good. Just like whales. It would be a good thing for us to look up, because if it's very similar, then we would say, well, look at that. Surprise, surprise. It has a higher functioning sonar, so it doesn't need to smell to hunt. So same exact thing.
Yeah, let's knock out these genes and see what the phenotypic effect is.
Right.
I am currently under the persuasion that these are not truly broken genes and that we can predict functions. I think we've demonstrated that. But even for sake of argument, if they are broken genes, it doesn't mean that these whales evolved from mammalian tetrapods. Really, either way, I would argue it's not very good evidence for whale evolution from a creature like Pakicetus to a blue whale over time. Would you agree with that?
That's why they're not used as arguments very often. That's why they stick to the fossils. That's their main go-to.
They love the fossils.
Yeah. Embryology is just so ridiculous.
Okay, well, I think this was good. I think this was comprehensive. I bounced ideas off of you, played devil's advocate a little bit. You had some great slides, great visuals, excellent responses. And so overall, we've now addressed in one video the fossil evidence, and in this video the arguments from embryology and also genetics, like these pseudogene arguments, olfactory pseudogenes, and the supposed tooth genes. So Matt, okay, I'm pretty happy with this video. I appreciate this. I appreciate your research and just the back and forth discussion on it. Any final words, final thoughts you want to make, brother, before we wrap up this video?
No, it was a good one. It was just winging it.
Right. Yeah. to the audience, this is largely preliminary. These are our thoughts, and we are not persuaded by these arguments. We think there's sufficient responses and counters available, and this roughly hour video has provided some of those. So hopefully there's some food for thought, and praying this is edifying to our viewer. This is going to first be a Patreon video, so a patron first video, and so our ministry supporters will get first viewing, and then we will premiere it for the public. And so, okay, Matt, God bless, brother. To the audience, God bless you. And Donny and Matt are out.